In this video, we're going to build an API gateway that's going to sit in between our clients and our origin server, where we can enforce protections like rate limiting and authentication using Zuplo, which is a fully managed serverless gateway platform that you can use, and it runs at the edge, and they've also kindly sponsored this video. So let's get into this. Now, Zuplo, as I mentioned, is a fully managed serverless gateway that runs on the edge. Now, it typically sits between your client and your backend API, which is also called your origin server. And your clients can be other servers. They can be websites, apps, or IoT devices. And the traffic is then going to be proxied through your Zuplo gateway, where you can enforce protections like rate limiting and authentication, validate the request before it actually hits your own backend. So as you can see here in this diagram, this is the client, different apps or sites that want to use your API, and you're going to send them through Zuplo to make sure that they're not going over their rate limits or they're authenticated before they access your backend. Now, the Zuplo runtime is built on top of web worker technologies like Cloudflare workers or Vercel Edge functions. If you have ever deployed your functions as edge functions or using the edge runtime in Vercel in your NextJs applications, this is using the same environment, which is deployed across the globe using the edge runtime. And this has several advantages, including close to 0 millisecond startup time. So this doesn't have the cold start problem typically associated with serverless functions, where it takes time for your container or for your virtual machine to start before actually processing and responding to the request. Because the edge runtime is a subset of the web API, it actually starts pretty fast, and you still have access to most of the standard web APIs like the fetch API or the response request and response APIs. Now, this means that Zuplo adds minimal latency to your backend, typically milliseconds. So proxying your traffic through Zuplo, it's not going to affect or add latency to your backend service. It is going to sit in between, run at the edge with close to 0 milliseconds startup time to actually process your requests or authenticate your requests or enforce any other protection that you want before the requests are hitting your backend. So we're going to follow this setup guide or a getting started guide that they have in the documentation. So if you head to the documentation, you can actually follow along with me, where we're going to build an app to have an API so that we can fetch some to-dos from. Then we're going to actually create this gateway using Zuplo to sit in between our client and our server. And then we're going to implement authentication and rate limiting pretty fast and pretty easy using Zuplo. So we're going to head to the step 1, which is setting up a basic gateway. Now, in the first step to set up a basic gateway, they're using a demo API at todos.zuplo.io. So if I click on this, you're getting a 401 unauthorized response back because our request doesn't have this secret API key. And this is how you would want to secure your backend to only allow requests coming in through your gateway and not directly. So there's actually this guide here. So if you go to the docs, going to production here, securing your backend. So here in this diagram, you can see if these are the clients on the left-hand side, and this is your API or your origin server, you only want to allow traffic that is coming through your Zuplo to make sure that you're enforcing the rate limiting or authentication. And if somebody is trying to access your service directly, you should stop that. Now, there are different ways that you can implement this authentication between your gateway and your origin server. One of the most popular ones, and the one that we're going to use in this example, is having a secret or an API key. So inside of your routes, your API endpoints on your origin server, you're going to check for a header that's a specific secret key that only your server has, and you're going to store that using environment variables on your server. And then inside your Zuplo account or your Zuplo gateway, you would also include that secret key, again, in an environment variable. So therefore, when this is talking to your backend, it has that API key, so your server allows that. But if somebody else tries to hit that endpoint, they're not going to go through because they do not have that secret key. Now, there are different ways that you can also authenticate your gateway to your origin server that you could read through the documentation here. We're going to use this shared API or secret key. So going back to the step that we have been, we're not going to use this todos.zuplo.io. You're more than welcome to do that. All you need to do here is to actually use the API key that they're going to give back to you inside of the secret. So if you hit this endpoint again inside of this message, they're giving you the hint that you need to set a header that has the API key. Let me make this a bit bigger. And then they also give you this API key. So you don't want to share this secret with your clients. This is just for the purpose of this tutorial that they're telling you, hey, this is how you would just secure it. Use the API key in the header with this value, and then you would go through this, and then you would get the to-dos back. We're going to actually build something similar using a NextJS app. So let me show you what I've built so far. This is a brand new NextJS application using TypeScript and Tailwind CSS. And all I had done is to create this API folder where we have a hello endpoint that is going to just return a simple response of hello world. So if I go to my application right now, if I head to API/hello, we're getting the hello world. And I also have this to-dos endpoint where I'm faking a database call, and I'm going to show you what we're doing in this function for us in a second. But assuming that we're fetching this data from our database or for whatever service that we're using, and then I'm returning a response which includes this to-dos back to the response. So if I go API and then to-dos, you see that I'm getting a list of my to-dos back. Now I'm using route handlers in the app router to create these endpoints. And in short, they're a replacement for API endpoints in the pages router. You can turn any segment inside of the app router to an endpoint by exporting a route.ts or JS from it. If you're not familiar with this concept, I do have videos on the channel where I'm going to include a link in the description so you can learn about route handlers. But from a high level, you export named functions such as this get, post, or whatever other HTTP verb or endpoint you want to expose from this route.ts files that turns the segment into an endpoint. Now you don't have to put them inside the API folder. I just did it for it to make more sense, but you can turn any endpoint or any segment into an endpoint, and it doesn't have to necessarily be inside of the API. Now I'm also running this route handler on the edge runtime so that it is fast for the same reasons as I mentioned for Zuplo. And now let's look at this get to-dos function. So what I'm doing here, I've created this lib folder where I have this fake DB. Here I'm exporting a function called get to-dos. I'm using the server only package from React to make sure this code only runs on the server. And again, this is faking a database call. Here I'm just fetching a mock API endpoint. I've shown this API before on the channel if you don't know. So mock API, you could just go create projects and create endpoints. You can define schemas, for example, users or to-dos here I have defined. And if you look at the data here, has created, title is completed, and ID for to-dos. And you can just create, data, how many of these resources that you want, and then it exposes an endpoint for you to fetch those. Now, this is going to simulate a database call or fetching your resources. I'm just getting these resources from the mock API, and I'm just sending them back to whoever that calls this. So back inside of our route, we're just awaiting this call, which is going to get our data back, and then we're going to send this response to the users. Now, this is going to be our origin server. This is going to be the endpoint that we want to protect or proxy through our Zuplo gateway. So right now, as I mentioned, if you just go to API to-dos, it just gives you all the to-dos back. So let's actually go ahead and secure our backend or our endpoint to only respond if the request has a secret key, which we're going to then implement in our own Zuplo gateway. So therefore, our backend only responds to requests coming from our own gateway. So let's actually access our headers list by invoking the headers function from next header. So I'm going to import it up top here. Then we're going to access the secret by calling the headers list.get, and we can expect a secret, let's say key, on the header. And then we're going to check to see if this secret is not equal to the secret that we have on the server. So process.env. Let's call this also a secret underscore key. If this is not equal, we're going to return next response, and we're going to say message or error, you might say, unauthorized, and then we're going to also include a status of 401. So let's go ahead in our environment variables. I have included this .env.example. I can also add this secret key, and inside my .env.local I have the API endpoint, so mock API endpoint. You can pass in a secret key. This needs to be a secret key. You should not share it with anyone, but I'm just using this super secret key string as an example. This is going to be the same thing we can also set inside of our Zuplo account, so therefore these two values can match and our server can allow this request to actually go through. So let's go back to the documentation and see what is the next step. So to get started, sign into portal.zuplo.com and create a free account and create an empty project. So let's head to the portal where we can actually sign up for a new account. We're going to use Gmail to log in. So if this is the first time you create an account, just as it is for me here, is going to prompt you to create a new project. I'm just going to call this YouTube, and I'm going to click the empty project. So this is a fresh empty slate for us to start adding our routes. Going back to the documentation, our first step is to actually add a route. Now to continue and add a route, let me just close this VS Code since we're done creating that endpoint and also securing it to request or check for a secret key. So I have the documentation and the portal side by side over here. So here to add a route, we can just go to this routes.oas.json. This is open API specifications and how you would create routes. You can also just import your specifications if you have already designed that with OpenAPI. But here we can use the route designer, which allows us to define the methods or what we actually want to do with the incoming requests and add policies. And then this is going to automatically add whatever we create to our specifications, which is going to then also create our documentation. So let's hit this add route. And as you can see here, we want to create a get method to all to-dos to just fetch all of our to-dos. And in this case, they're just forwarding the URL to todos.zuplo.io. We're going to forward this to our own origin server. Now the app we created together is also deployed on Vercel. It's nextzuplo.vercel.com. This is the same endpoint that we had. And if I go to API/hello, it works. It says hello. Let me just make this also bigger. But if I go and now try to access the to-dos, it tells me unauthorized because I don't have the secret key here. And this is what we're going to also set up in Zuplo. So Zuplo is the only one that can talk to our backend. So let's go back to our portal here. We're going to say get all to-dos. This is the summary. The path is going to be /to-dos. So the method is get. You have access to different methods to handle different requests hitting this endpoint that you have. As far as the course policies, you can apply course or you can just let everything go through. Now down here in the policies section, we're going to add policies here for rate limiting and authentication in the next steps. For now, we just want to handle this request by deciding what we want to do with this incoming request. You could forward it to your own endpoint. You can rewrite it or redirect it or invoke a function against it. We're just going to forward it to our own endpoint, which is the deployed version of the to-do app we just created in NextJS at this API endpoint, and then this is going to be /API. Now, if I go ahead and save these changes, I can actually test this endpoint or a request right here from the portal. You click on this test, it allows you to hit this /todos endpoint. So if I do this, I'm expecting to get a 401 unauthorized because again, I do not have that secret key. So if you're hitting this endpoint, it's going to forward this request to our own deployed version, to our own backend or origin server, but it does not have a secret key, so it just gives me unauthorized. Now in the next step, it explains actually how to add this secret header. So for this, we can add a policy in the policy section of the request. The policy that we're going to create is adding a request header. We're going to add a request header. For them is API key. For us, we called it secret key. If you remember from the code we just did a second ago in our Next.js application, we can then save our secret key that only our origin server knows, also as an environment variable inside of Zuplo. So therefore, when an incoming request comes to Zuplo, Zuplo is going to add this specific secret key to it and then forward it to our backend. So our backend can actually authenticate that this is coming from Zuplo because it has that secret key and responds to it. So let's just do this one step at a time. We're going to actually go to policies, add a policy. We're going to set headers. So let's search for headers, add or set request headers. And down here, as you can see, you specify the name. So we specified the name to be secret dash key. This is what we named it inside of our own application. And now for the value, let's actually store this inside of an environment variable. So you go $env, and then you pass in the environment variable name. Maybe we call this secret underscore key. You can just follow this. If you want to apply the API key and use Zuplo's endpoint, you can just do what the doc says. In our application, we set the secret key, so I'm expecting a secret key environment variable here. Now I hit OK here, and now I can go from the settings to the environment variables tab. I can create a new environment variable. I called it secret underscore key, and I'm going to mark this as a secret. This is a secret key, and this is the only way that you would authenticate against your backend. And the value that we set was super underscore secret underscore key. This needs to be a secret key, and you should not expose it to your GitHub or your clients. I'm just saying it because it's a string that we want to set over here. So let's save that up. Now, if I go back to my files and actually save everything that we had done, go back inside of the routes.oas.json, we now have this endpoint we just created, which is going to get the to-dos, which is going to now add this policy or add this header to any incoming request to this endpoint. It's going to include our secret key as we added it here, and then it's going to forward it to our own backend. And this time I'm expecting to be authenticated, so therefore we can get the list of the to-dos back. So if you go ahead, you can see I get 200 back, and now I'm getting the list of to-dos here. And that was the first step. We added a route to our gateway, and we also authenticated our gateway with our own backend server by including this secret key in the header, using this policy so that our backend knows that this is coming from our own gateway. Now, moving on from this step, it's just explaining how to add the new environment variables as we did for our secret key here. We also tested our API by going to the test panel inside of our portal. Now, as a bonus point or an extra thing you can do is to also store your URL inside of an environment variable. So you see here, when we are forwarding our requests to our own endpoint, you can actually store this base URL in an environment variable. And the reason why you would want to do that is you can have different environments in Zuplo. Right now, we are in the working copy of our account. Once you deploy this gateway to the edge, it would be a production branch or a production environment. And for those production environment, maybe you want to use a different base URL, and you can control all of that through your environment variables to have different connections to databases or different resources for staging, production, and development and whatnot. So you can do that on your own. It's just basically setting another environment variable. You're going to go to the environment variable tabs. You're going to create a new one called base URL. This is not a secret one, so you can leave that is secret on check and paste in your endpoint that you're going to use in this specific environment. For us is the working copy or the development environment. And then inside of this URL forward, instead of just pasting in now your URL, you're going to just point this into this environment variable, which is this curly braces and then env.base URL. Now, the next step is actually authenticating the requests coming in to our gateway, the consumers of our API. So imagine clients, websites, or developers on the end or on the other side that want to use your API. And now we're going to give them our gateway so that they can hit our gateway. Our gateway is going to talk to our backend, but we want to actually authenticate who is calling our gateway. Because up until this point, anybody can now hit our Zuplo gateway. Let me actually just show you. If you go back to getting started, your gateway URL is just going to be here. So if I open this in a new page and actually go to /to-dos, which is the path we just created, it gives me back all the to-dos. Now, because this is going through Zuplo, Zuplo is already authenticated against our backend. So our backend actually responds to it, and Zuplo just forwards that request to the backend and gets this to-dos back here. Now we want to authenticate, so therefore developers or clients cannot hit this gateway without having an API key, and I hope that makes sense. So let's go to the next step where we can authenticate incoming requests to Zuplo or to our gateway using an API key. The first step is to add the API key authentication policy. So again, inside of our policies, we're going to add an API authentication policy, as you can see down here. So your API key authentication policy should be one of the first policies that run to authenticate the incoming request before doing anything else. So this is showing that you can drag and drop policies to run in different orders. Now, if we test this after we create the policy, in a second, we're going to get a 401 unauthorized response because we have not issued any API key for any consumer to actually call our API endpoint. So let's take this one step at a time. We're going to go to our routes inside the get to-dos route. We're going to go to policies, and inside policies, we're going to actually add the authentication or API key authentication here. So if you click OK here, this is going to add this policy again. We're going to drag this to be the first policy that runs. We want to authenticate the request coming into our gateway. If they're not authenticated, we don't want to even continue setting headers or forwarding this to our backend. We want to just send a response back. Now, if I save this and actually go ahead to test, now we're going to get a 401 unauthorized response because we have not issued any API key for our consumers, for our client or developers to actually use to hit this endpoint. Now, we're using the same test client here in Zuplo. You could run this requests to your gateway endpoint from Postman, for example, but you're going to get the same response if you try to hit your gateway endpoint /to-dos. You're going to get a 401 unauthorized because it is expecting you to have an API key. Now, inside of our portal, we have not issued any API key, so therefore it's going to 401. I'm going to use this test client inside portal because it's easier, but no matter from where you send this request, you should have the same experience. Now, to create a consumer key, you can go to your settings to API consumer. You can then create a new consumer, give them a subject, an ID, a name. This is going to represent that consumer. A consumer can have multiple keys. You can include an email, And this is going to be, for example, the developer's email that's requesting for an API key to actually use your API. So you're going to include this email. Now, if this developer now signs in to your portal using the same email, this API key is going to be associated with them. Now, as an extra feature, you can add some metadata here to this user, which is going to be available to you on the request object. It gets hydrated with the user information. You can pass in here foreign keys from your database, or in this example, if you're just specifying the tier that they're on, maybe they're a free customer, we want to have different options or maybe different rate limits for a free account versus a premium account, which we're going to see shortly. And once we do that, the developer or the consumer on the other end of this API can access their key through the developer portal or our documentation, which we're going to see in a second. So let's again take this one step at a time. Let's go to our settings. We're going to go to API key consumers. I'm going to add a new consumer. Let's just call this Cosmo. And then the key manager is going to be hello@hamidbahram.io. And then I'm going to include a metadata to say the customer type, include a proper JSON here. So customer type is free. We're going to contrast this with a different customer type later on. So let's save this up. And I have generated this API key here. Now, one thing for your developers now to use, or for the clients or consumers that actually requested this API key, if you go back to your files and go back to getting started, you can see this developer portal. This is automatically generated for you. So let me open this up. This is your developer portal, the documentation to your API endpoints based on the endpoints and specifications that you have designed inside Zuplo. This is generated automatically here. Now, as you can see, I have this get all to dos endpoint already here. It has this, let me just make this a bit bigger. It has this code snippets that they can select and choose where they want to run this request. It also tells them that this is protected by an API key. They need to pass in a bearer token to be able to access this endpoint. Now, if I sign in here with the same Google account that I used inside the consumer that I created in my Zuplo portal, I should be able to see my key here. So let's go ahead and sign in with the same account. Again, remember, this is the developer or the consumer of our API. They can just sign in to our documentation or developer portal that's created automatically for us by Zuplo. Once they sign in with the same email that we used to define our consumer API keys here, so this is the same email that I have here, now they'd be able to access their key here and include it inside of their application so that they can authenticate actually calling our API endpoints or our gateway. They can actually also roll the key, create new keys, edit the label and whatnot to be able to actually use our endpoint. So I just copied that key coming back inside of Zuplo. If I go to our files and now going to our routes, if I go to the to-dos and actually open up the test environment, now I need to add an author. So just to test this again, before I add the auth header, if you remember, we were not authorized to access this because we now need an authorization header. This is going to be a bearer token. And then I'm just going to paste in my API key. Now this time, if I go ahead, it actually authenticates this specific developer. I'm just testing it inside Zuplo again. This can be from the developer side because they have an authorization key set now. And this is the same key we defined inside of our Zuplo portal. They now get a 200 OK and get the to-dos back. And that's how easy you can implement API key authentication in your gateway. Again, we added this policy inside of our route to require an API key. We then issued an API key for our consumers here. We then send the developer on the other end to our documentation or developer portal where they can actually see what endpoints we have. And because we created an API key for them, once they sign in with the same email, they should be able to see their key, which they can use it to authenticate with our gateway. Now moving down these steps, this is what we have done, adding the API key authentication and actually testing it with an authorization header to get a 200 response back. In the next step, we're going to implement rate limiting just as easy as we did with the API key authentication by adding a policy to our route. Now, you would never want to ship an API without rate limiting because your consumers, a bad actor, or your internal developers can actually accidentally or intentionally take down your service by hitting your API endpoint too many times. Now, this can be from your consumers that actually have a for loop or a bad use of use effect in React, just hit your endpoint, or maybe an intentional bad user is just trying to take down your service or overuse your resources. This is very easy to implement inside Zuplo. You can easily add a rate limiting policy to your route. There are different algorithms that you can use for rate limiting. I'm going to include links in the description if you want to actually dive deeper into that context. Here we're going to use a user-based rate limiting because we already have them authenticated against an API key. Whether they're using a free account or not, they should have an API key to be able to access our API. So it's very easy to implement a rate limiting when you actually have a known user. Now, another reason for rate limiting is actually have different rate limits for different tiers or different consumers. For example, if a consumer is a free tier or is a free consumer, we want to give them maybe 5 requests a minute. But if we have a premium or paid user, we want to actually increase their limit so that they can use our resources or our API endpoints better or more. So we're going to see that dynamic rate limiting later on once we implemented the basic rate limiting, but that is another reason besides protecting against service takedowns or DDoS attacks that you have different tiers for your service, for your API, for your SaaS, and you want to give them different access to your resources through this dynamic rate limiting policy. So the first thing that we would want to do is to add a policy. The policy is called rate limiting. Now, assuming that you have followed the previous step and set up the API key authentication, we can now set up the rate limit policy against the user rather than their API address. Again, because we have this step, it's a known user through the API key. We can set the rate limit by to the user instead of the IP address, which is not as accurate as the API key or the known user. Now, in this instance, we are only allowing 1 request per minute. And after 1 request, they're going to receive a 429 too-many request response. So let's go back to our portal and actually implement this by going to our files, going to our routes, the to-dos route. Inside of our policies, we want to add rate limiting. So we add this. And again, because we now authenticated the user, we can go the rate limit by user. Maybe we can allow 1 request in every minute. Let's hit OK here. We're going to save this. We're going to wait for this to actually populate. We're going to open up the test client here. And now if I hit test, the first time I'm going to get a 200 OK. But if I hit it again, I'm going to get the 429 too many requests because I only allowed 1 request per minute. You can change this to however many you want per seconds or per minutes, but that's how easy you can implement rate limiting in your gateway or against your API endpoint. Now, the second step to this is actually implementing a dynamic rate limiting, similar to what I have explained, to have different limits for different type of customers, for free customers or for premium plans. So what we're going to do here is inside of any API key that we create, if you remember, we actually also included a metadata object where we defined the consumer type to be free for the first API key that we created. And then we can have different consumer types, and depending on their consumer type, we're going to give them a different rate limit. So let's see how we're going to do that. So first thing is that we have to create another consumer to have a different key or a different tier of customer type. So let's actually close this up. I'm going to go to my settings to API consumer keys. Now I'm going to create another one. This is going to be the premium. I'm going to include the same developer or consumer. So hello at hamedbahram.io. And then here inside of the metadata, I'm going to say this customer type is actually premium. It's not the free version, it's the premium version. Now, if I go back to the developer portal for this specific consumer and I refresh the page, we should be able to see the second key generated here as well. So now they have two keys. One key was for the free account or the free tier. The other one is this key. So they can use this key to authenticate or have access to the premium features, maybe an increased rate limit, whereas this one is going to have a reduced amount of access to our API. Now, to implement this dynamic rate limiting in Zuplo, we'd have to create a function or a module where we access the user data on the request object and read their tier or the customer type. And depending on that, we're going to return a different rate limit or a different specification for our rate limit. So let's actually go ahead to our portal. We're going to go to our files, and right here where it says modules, there's a plus sign. You can just click this and actually create an empty module. You can maybe call this rate-limit.ts, and inside of it, you can go ahead and copy this code that you see here. So let me just copy this from the documentation, and we're going to explain what this does in a second. So inside of here, I just copied it here. It's a bit bigger here. So what we're doing on this rate limit function that we're exporting from this module is that we're going to access the user data on the request. This is going to hydrate this specific user based on their API key, and it's going to include that metadata object we actually set when we created the API key. So we have access to that consumer type we just created. And if they are premium, we're going to allow them to have 1,000 requests per minute. And if they're free, we're going to allow them to have maybe 5 or 1 or whatsoever. And then for everybody else, we're going to return maybe 30 requests per minute. This doesn't make sense. So maybe for everybody else, we're going to have a lower amount, but you get the idea. So now that we have this function, we actually have to go and update our policy, the rate limit policy that we had, to use this function instead of using whatever default algorithm or logic it was using before. So let's actually go ahead and save this. Let's go back to our files, to our routes. Let's go our to-dos. And now here inside of our policies, we have this rate limiting. We can actually also bring this higher. So once we authenticate the user, we want to limit, we want to check the rate limiting policy before actually setting any headers. But inside of here, instead of just doing the default logic, we're going to copy and paste this logic from the documentation, which is going to rate limit by this function we created. And the identifier is this rate limit function we exported from our module. And the module is this rate limit module we just created. So this is just pointing to the function we exported and to the name that we set for our module. So it's going to run this function to decide how it wants to limit or apply this policy to the requests. And inside of this policy, going back to our policies here to the module, this rate limit policy, we said, hey, if the customer type is premium, allow them 1,000 requests. If it is free, maybe allow them 5. And then for everybody else, just maybe 1 request per minute. So let's save this up. And now we're going to wait for this to populate, going back to our route, going back to the to-dos, to the test area. I'm still using the API key I have from the first consumer that I created. So if I test with this, it should give me a 200. But if I keep hitting this until I get over 5 requests, this is what I selected for my free account. As you can see, I get the 429 too many requests. But if I now go ahead and actually copy this premium key we just created and bring it back to our authorization header, so we are now calling it that premium customer type key, it's going to give us a 200, but I'm allowed 1,000 requests per minute. So even if I go over 5, which was the limit for the free tier, it won't give me a 429. So here in this step, not only we implemented rate limiting very easily by adding a policy inside of our route, we also implemented a dynamic rate limiting logic where we look at the individual specific user and decide their access to our resources depending on their plan. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We created an API gateway that sits in between our clients and our own backend origin server, where we implemented protections like API key authentication and rate limiting using Zuplo. Now, in this example, we only had a get endpoint. Obviously, you can extend this application or this gateway by having more routes to update or create new resources or delete resources. Now, another thing I want to mention is that up until this point, we've been working in the working copy environment in Zuplo. This is not yet deployed to the edge, and it's not meant to be used with production applications. Actually, the next step in the getting started guide is deploying to the edge. You can go ahead and continue through that step on your own, where you would connect a GitHub repository to your Zuplo project to create different branches and different environments and deploy to the edge. I may create a second part to this video where we would extend on this application by creating more routes and actually deploying to the edge. So stay tuned. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.